Can everyone hear me okay? Good. Right, hopefully you're all feeling a bit refreshed now. And we are now going to look at the Council's adjustments to the transformational sites. I think we've clarified which sites were part of the uplift, the HBC field site and the Sitex site. And also the Council's evidence sets out the projected start dates, etc., etc. So that's a starting point. My next question related to whether there's evidence to support the fact that 70% of the forecast economic uplift arising from those sites would happen within the local plan period. Now, obviously, on the basis of the Council's revised projections set out in Matter 4A, the Council's recent evidence, that projection is now looking more likely to be 50% of those sites coming forward. And it's really just to probe the Council on the evidence behind the assumptions that 50% of those transformational sites would come forward within the local plan period up to 2037. So if I could ask, is it Mr. Cross who would be responding on that?
Yep, thank you. As I said, the source of the figures is derived from, was supplied to us by the joint venture partnership. Given the nature of the enterprise zone, they do have to basically draw down or apply to a degree for public funds to help support certain each phase of the development. As I believe at present, they have the sales with on site with the next phase, and they have funding secured for the phase after that. It's an ongoing process where they will draw down where necessary additional funds to help basically prime the later phases. The enterprise zone status, I believe, runs until 2037, and there is some discussion about potentially seeking to extend that period as the build out is liable to be, extend beyond the current local plan period. They say the figures are supplied. They say we believe they were supplied in good faith with the best information available at this time, and the figures that we have used. I stress that the figures haven't changed between the housing topic paper and the current position. The figures that are presented and our latest evidence were the figures that were presented to us in 2020 when we were preparing the housing topic paper. The council, whenever we were dealing with them, we took a cautious approach in terms of the reduction. So we basically thought that 70%, rather than basically applying the full 50%, would basically potentially be more reasonable in terms of making sure that we weren't underplaying the housing requirement that may arise from the site.
Sorry, just to rewind a little bit. So the figures provided to us in terms of the sites coming forward, did you say they haven't necessarily changed from the figures provided from the regeneration team before that? You've just applied a different deduction. Is that right?
Effectively, I say we've had two different sets of figures from the regeneration team with regard to these sites. The first set was provided whenever we were undertaking the Shelma, and then we've had one additional set that was provided last year. That set did show that the delivery on the enterprise zone was liable to be about 50% of the original projection. The council chose not to apply the full 50% discount. Was rather we thought we would apply a 70% discount, so as to basically build in that little bit of flexibility within the adjustment.
Okay, sorry, that wasn't clear. I think in the original in the original set of figures, but that's useful to clarify. And just coming back to the evidence, obviously the information's been supplied by the regeneration team. I suppose I'm really just trying to drill down in terms of the assumptions that they're making in terms of when those sites are going to come forward, and it's not sort of entirely clear to me what assumptions have been used, and it may be something that we have to go back to the regeneration team on, but it would be useful just to expand on that point.
Well, as I understand it, the council has been pressing the joint venture to undertake a comprehensive master plan for the site. That hasn't been undertaken as of yet. I believe, as I mentioned previously, that they are actually in the process at the moment of doing a development strategy, not quite a full master plan, but basically a delivery strategy. And that may well be available and presented by the representatives of the joint venture at the next in time for the next round of hearing sessions. Basically, they were represented yesterday, Spofford's representing the JV, and I believe that they are scheduled potentially to be appearing tomorrow. So effectively, I say you might want to direct some of the questions to them in terms of the later or the current timetable. Obviously, we did ask our regeneration director to provide confirmation of the figures, and we have appended that to our latest statement.
Okay, so let's put Sporforths on the spot tomorrow then. In terms of the HBC field, obviously we've got 300 units developed already, or 300 jobs developed. What's the position in relation to phase 2, and how much certainty can we attach to the remainder of that coming forward on phase 2?
It's basically the information supplied to me said the potential for that being delivered in 2023. It is basically covered as part of, as I understand, a single planning application. So effectively, it enjoys extant consent. So with the partial implementation of phase 1, so effectively they have permissions in place, and the company can basically implement that at any point. I suspect that the implementation will effectively be triggered by the company securing contracts to supply trains. So they say it's probably going to be market driven.
Yeah, so there was a delay, wasn't there, in the national sort of program of issuing contracts, I believe. Would that be right?
I don't have information on that, but I say we can try and find some information. But
okay, thank you, Mr. Burns.
Thank you, Ma'am. I think obviously it's very important where we're at in terms of it, whether it's 70%, 49.5% discount. I think we sort of need to take a step back from my point of view. Obviously, the adjustments that's being made by the council relates to the jobs delivery on the transformational sites, and Mr. Cross pointed us to figure 5 of SD32 just before lunch, which suggests that it shows the difference between jobs growth as a result of the transformational sites and baseline jobs growth, and you've got that sort of very big blue checked box in that figure, which suggests showing that. A point of clarification from my point of view, I can't get that data to tally up with anything in Shelmer, so it would be really helpful for me to understand exactly where that data's come from. Now that's relevant because obviously the Shelmer sets out that it's a 2-stage process to how this growth scenario has been calculated. On one side of it, local authorities have been asked the question about transformational site, but on the other side, the LEP have obviously provided a set of growth ambitions and targets. So it's not solely down to transformational sites. And that's very important when we're actually considering whether it's 70%, 50% discount that the council feel they should be applying. Now, helpfully, Shelmer does provide some information as to where these jobs will be created by broad sectors, and that's in tables 15, which is the baseline scenario, and table 16, which is the growth scenario. That sets out the broad sector of employment in both scenarios for Halton. And what's quite telling in that, having just run a few calculations during lunch, any opportunity to open an Excel spreadsheet for me, so I apologise. What's quite telling is actually the big differences in full-time equivalent jobs growth numbers, so they don't quite marry up with the total figures that are presented elsewhere in the document. But the greatest jobs growth is envisaged in health. It's not envisaged in professional and scientific, manufacturing, or even transport. And you actually compare those two tables, and you can see that health accounts for 3,400 of the additional jobs, education 900. And then you look at the professional and scientific focus, and also if you include business support, which I suspect forms part of Daresbury, that's actually only accounting for 1,300 of those difference in jobs. So I think we almost need to take a step back to really understand how many of those jobs are actually as a result of the transformational site, because the data in Shelmer, tables 15 and 16, and the types of jobs being generated in those two transformational sites, they really don't marry up or support the approach that the council's taking.
Thank you, Mr. Burns. Mr. Cross, do you want to come back on those points in relation to the jobs growth figures?
Sorry, what was the sectors that you particularly? Sorry. The sectors that are of particular concern, health. And we're looking at table 15 and 16, which for Halton shows 0 growth baseline in health and 100 in the growth scenario. Am I looking at the right table?
Yeah, sorry, that's my error. Yeah,
professional and scientific professional and scientific is 4,300 under the growth scenario, and 1,500 under the baseline.
Yeah, sorry, I've entered a figure for Knowsley on health. Apologies for that.
Sorry.
I think
it's the health sector again.
Yeah, I think it would be useful to undertake a proper comparison to support the position and whether it correlates there.
So the broader point, Mr. Burns, is, as I've touched on earlier, that that there are that it is anticipated to be jobs growth in other sectors in addition to the transformational sites. It's not just transformational sites that would be contributing to the jobs growth. I think that was a broader point.
Yeah, that's the broader point.
Yeah. I don't know to what extent, Mr. Cross, that those can be extracted from the model.
The information supplied to the council, obviously, is a party to the study. We did receive copious spreadsheets of tabular data, and we're more than happy to share that. We can either have it uploaded as an Excel spreadsheet, or we can have it uploaded as PDF, whatever would assist.
That might be helpful. May need your help in interpreting it. There's something possibly we can come back to tomorrow in tomorrow's session as well. Mr. Bolton.
Thank you. Just looking at the changes that are being made, whereby the council are using, if like, a 70%, from my understanding, they're assuming 70% of the transformational sites are going to be delivered within the plan period, and they're using that, if you like, to generate a jobs-led housing requirement, and that's my understanding of what they've got on page 3 of their 4A or their matter 4 submission. No, it's 4A, isn't it? But when one looks at what the change, if you like, that's occurred, and that's on page 9, and if you like, the revised delivery, it's only 47% of SciTech that's going to be delivered in the plan period, and that's the change, it would seem. So why have a more robust figure to generate a higher housing requirement? That those don't seem to. I mean, the whole thing seems to be, as I said, seems to be confused and unsound. But clearly, the difference between those two figures, it would seem that the evidence would be pointing to 47%. Rather than the 70% in that particular case, and I have problems with the evidence overall, as I've already expressed. It seems to be, an expression of one person who comments on what might be delivered, and you've questioned about the evidence base, and it doesn't seem to be getting any clearer or any stronger in terms of merely being a forecast of potential employments from those sites which don't actually have a master plan or a delivery plan at the moment. So it's employment rather than housing, but it certainly wouldn't be passing any test of delivery if they were housing sites. And it seems to me that the council are putting an awful lot of weight on this, because it's the only evidence they have. And my view is, as presently drafted, the plan's unsound in terms of the uplift. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Bowden. Mr. Cross, just picking up that point on the percentage deduction, if you like. Why was it 47%, Mr. Bowden? Why not 40%, 7%, for example?
Well, sorry, I say by my arithmetic, the difference between the originally supplied figures and the new supplied figures is 49.5%. But I say that's the arithmetic. As I say, whenever we were looking at effectively the potential impact on the housing figure, applying the full discount, it seemed there was quite a stretch from the original position in the Shelma and the position that the local plan was likely to take, had the standard method not completely upended the apple cart. We felt that 70% was a cautious reduction, and I think in a number of our assumptions we have taken erred on the side of caution in terms of trying to quantify the impact on the Shelma of the amended assumptions. And just a little point coming back just on the previous point, sorry. Figure 16 on page 23 of the housing topic paper shows the change by sector in terms of growth that we can provide that. To say we'll provide that with the baseline as well, so you can have it diagrammatically to show the sectoral change by sector between the baseline and the growth.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Pollard?
Thank you. Yeah, just in terms of, it's a point possibly repeated from earlier, but in terms of it being the only evidence, like I say, I'd suggest the council also looks at EL 099 in terms of supporting its growth scenario and the position there. The section started on page 40 of that document and running through certainly a couple of pages, and that's the Liverpool City Region LEP growth ambition scenario, which says they estimate targets and plans, focus targets of the LEP and the regeneration plans of the individual local authorities, and the impact there was uplifting in the forecast for Halton by 17,000 jobs, so slightly higher actually than the growth scenario, which would suggest outside of the transformational sites. Clearly, the forecasting house, based on the investment plans, widely viewed a quite positive position for the authority. So I think just to make the point there, that it's not the only piece of evidence that suggests strong economic growth credentials of the authority.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Pollard. Just in terms of the evidence to support those sites coming forward, I mean, obviously that we have the letter from Wesley Rourke, which sort of confirms those base dates, the projections. I'm just wondering whether, and it may be something that arises out of tomorrow's session as well, but in terms of supporting those projections, whether a paper could be prepared just pulling that together and pulling together the evidence behind those projections and why those projections are sort of set down on paper, just to expand the argument to aid my deliberations. I think I would find that useful. Sorry to add to your workload again.
I have to say we can inquire, but obviously that's dependent upon third party. So we can't promise that we'll be in a position to provide that, but we can make inquiries.
I appreciate the tests in a sense for employment sites tends to be slightly lower than so for delivery of housing sites, but I think as the uplift figure is based on those, it's something that I would certainly prefer some more reassurance on, that those sites are going to come forward at the rates projected. I think particularly given that the original jobs growth projections have significantly reduced. I need faith that those are going to come forward at the lower rates, and that there's not going to be further delays to those sites coming forward. So I think that would inform the hearing and help my consideration. So I'd add that to another action point. And it may be that we return to that discussion tomorrow as well. So just looking at the sort of calculation that you've set out in the revised table, and in a sense the robustness of that calculation, obviously it's possibly a more simplistic calculation than for any sort of demographic adjustments, I would suggest, but it would be interesting to get views as to whether those adjustments in relation to those sites would be appropriate adjustments and valid, if you like, and can be given weight in the calculation of that uplift figure. And I'd like to extend discussion out on that if anyone's got any views. In terms of how the calculation's been done in the revised table set out at page 3, in terms of just literally doing a pro rata adjustment. From my point of view, that there is there's a very clear link between the growth uplift figure, which has come from that figure has come from a calculation of the housing uplift required to get to that figure. So there is a clear link between those two figures. But is it appropriate to apply a percentage reduction, sort of statistically, if you like? And is that an appropriate adjustment to make? Mr. Harper.
I don't see why we don't just apply the actual figures rather than percentages. I mean, the difference between the 70% and the actual 49.5%, which is the numbers in front of us, is 2,386 jobs. So why not just add the numbers in rather than percentages?
Mr. Bolton.
Well, I mean, the problem you have here is that obviously the data they're working from is very old now. We know the age sex profile of migrants is different. Well, that seems to be a clear indication that it's different. And we know that unemployment's down. We also know that from where this was calculated, we also know that activity rates are up. So no, it's not just a straightforward, we're only going to have 49.5% of the jobs if you look at, and that's looking at the whole table rather than just the one of the two sites I was looking at. But you can have 50% of the jobs being created, but actually you can't provide enough housing to house 70% of those new jobs. So I understand it's being cautious in one direction, but it's being extravagant, if you like, in another direction. I would say, it seems to me that one percentage is wrong. It needs to actually be based on what we were talking about earlier, if you like, a remodelling of a jobs-led scenario. And secondly, that I don't think you can effectively plus an 80. You've got a growth scenario. We've got a standard growth scenario, and you've got a transformational growth scenario where you've added on top of that. And effectively what you're doing here is saying, given the evidence we now have about that transformational scenario, we're going to add on top of that again another 20%. That just seems wrong to me. It seems to lack any real justification.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Bolton. Mr. Pollard?
Thanks. Yeah, I think there are some definite challenges to doing it. I'm just looking at table 32 of the Shelmer, so that's EL 014. I think what the outcome of this is that shows the baseline scenario, it shows the growth scenario. So baseline scenario 3,800 jobs, growth scenario 12,400 jobs, and differential 8,600 jobs. Now, if we're looking at jobs rather than the housing figure, 70% of the 8,600, which is the difference, is about 6,000 jobs. So I guess the proposition is that Halton's economy will grow by the 3,800 plus the 6,000, so 9,800 jobs over the period where you're making that adjustment. And it does come back to an issue of here applying an assumption to an older forecast where everything else has moved forward as well. Because I'm just a bit uncomfortable how that less than 10,000 jobs fits with what's delivered in the recent past, and the only other available more up-to-date forecast, which is the one Mr. Robinson mentioned, is cited in his hearing statement, which actually suggests a baseline growth of over 12,000 jobs. And again, just comparing it with the other Oxford forecast, which was around 17,000 jobs, based on the LEPS forecast. Again, there's a lot of different job figures here, but the one that we've been advanced by the council, where it's applying a reduction, seems to be one of the lower ones, and I'm not clear or confident exactly where that is justified.
Thank you, Mr. Pollard. Ms. Harding?
Thank you. Yes, so I think I agree with Mr. Pollard there. I mean, I was going to say basically that I agree with the idea that there should be an uplift to deal with the economic growth. I think that there needs to be some consideration of how things have changed over time. I also think there needs to be some consideration of the role of not just the transformational sites, but also the other sectors that are proposed to see growth as well. I'm not so clear on whether the 70% is the right figure, or whether the 49.5% is the right figure, because as Mr. Pollard has pointed out, the evidence this is based on is very dated. Some of the more recent evidence is suggesting alternate figures to those as well. So sort of my summarised view is, yes, there should be some form of uplift. Whether this is the right one is debatable at the moment.
Okay, Mr. Usher.
Thank you, Ma'am. Just a quick point as well related to document EL 100, which is the Oxford Economics Liverpool City Region LEP growth scenario paper. Now, they've produced figure 4, which is on page 5, I think it is. There's no page numbers, but I think that's page 5. And you've got there you've got employments across the city region 2016 to 2040. And you've got the baseline scenario, which is 3,300 for Halton, and then you've got the growth scenario, which is 12,000. And just to add another figure to the fire almost, we've got hold of the latest Oxford Economics forecast, which are January 2021. They do take into account the effects of COVID and Brexit, and over that 2016 to 2040 period, the baseline forecast is for 10,400 jobs. So that's a baseline figure to be compared to what we had previously, which was 3,300 for that period.
Are those more recent projections in your evidence, Mr. Usher, with January 2021?
Yes, we've provided the figure for the 2012 to 2037 period. That's at, just bear with me. If you on page 10, the second to last bullet point, we look at the baseline figure there over the 2012 to 2037 period, which is 6,700. Again, it's over double the baseline figure that was reported in the Shelmer for that period. So, I think it does sort of reflect, these sort of latest figures reflect sort of the realism perhaps of that growth scenario.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Usher. Mr. Cross, would you like to come back on those particular points in relation to whether there's a need to look at more recent jobs growth data in terms of the original assumptions in the Shelmer?
We can certainly cover that. In terms of the most recent jobs growth, a number of parties quoted the ONS BRES survey data, which I think the source of the various parties saying 12,000 jobs growth over the planned period to date. I say we've included a short analysis of that in Appendix 2 to our latest paper 4A. Effectively, again, it seemed high to us, so we thought we'd have a look to try and see what was going on, and effectively, we think we've identified a bit of a data spike in the figures. Effectively, we have had this in the past, and I have a smile occasionally whenever people are mentioning the health sector. It always seems to be the health sector that we get spurious results, and where the figures for an individual year will jump by 10 or 5 or 6,000, only to fall back by pretty much the same the following year. So we have had a look at the individual sectors, And the chart, the second chart under paragraph 3.3, you don't particularly need to look at the individual the data too closely, but you can see that from that it is quite clear that a couple of sectors are showing volatility, and the key sectors are pulled out in the following graph. And again, it shows that the health sector has shown a marked increase. We had our colleagues in our research department contact ONS for some clarification on those figures, and we're told that it was in the health sector, it was correctly coded to that ward. However, they suspect it is something like it's an agency company who is dealing with payroll for people that are not actually located necessarily close by to that location. And they also confirmed that that particular data point will not appear in the next year's data. So I think that I say it's about 4,000 of that growth is potentially not necessarily spurious. I say it's not necessarily a data anomaly, but it's not necessarily indicative of those 4,000 people actually physically working within the locality. So we think the numbers are slightly overestimated. In terms of the general increased growth, the baseline, then I say it comes back to a little bit the crux of the matter in terms of our second table. And effectively, the guidance is quite clear that if we're doing a standard method plus approach, we have to consider what constitutes the plus. And the examples that are given in the guidance is the presence of a growth strategy. The fact that your economy is thankfully or luckily performing well is not an oddity, and that is something that would be dealt with, basically should be captured by the standard method. So we would argue that is basically on the standard method side of the calculation. It's not on the plus side of the calculation. The figures that we have available in terms of the growth strategy, so the addition, I say, is the difference between the Shelma growth strategy and the Shelma baseline.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Burns.
Thank you. Just reiterating what a few other people say, I'm uncomfortable with the approach that the council have taken with the deductions for the various reasons, but just very specifically on the business register and the BRES data, I think we just need to be careful that people are actually comparing like with like here. BRES data, you can't compare data from before 2015 because the approach and methodology that ONS undertake changed at that point, which makes the 2009 to 2014 data not comparable to the 2015 to 2019 data. I only mention that because there's several tables that don't acknowledge that point. So I think when you're talking about that 12,000 jobs growth, which I think is from 2014, Mr. Cross will correct me if I'm wrong, we just need to be careful that we are actually comparing like with like here. And I believe that change came out as a result of how BRES deals with PAYE based businesses. And those now being included in the methodology from 2015 onwards.
Okay, thank you. It would be useful for the participants who have put in revised jobs growth figures to comment on Mr. Cross's view on the sort of potential anomaly in the BRES data, but I'm also conscious that some of the participants' job growth figures are derived from Experian and other sources. So can I just take views on the graph in the council's additional evidence, and also how that relates to how the BRES data relates to other data such as Experian jobs growth data? Who would like to go first? I think, Mr. Robinson, you quoted jobs growth figures in your statement in terms of looking at the sort of how they compare to the Shelmer jobs growth figures. What's your view on that?
Yeah, so you're quite right. If you look at the our evidence, we've got the Experian 2020 figures for net job growth. And as people have been saying, there are about 11,900, so just under 12,000 for that period 2014 to 2037. So that factored in the implications of Brexit, and of course tried to do as best they can the implications of the COVID-19 pandemic, which isn't that far away from the growth scenario. So the growth scenario that was modelled in the Shell, obviously 12,400. So higher in Experian 2020 projections, but not hugely higher, so along the same trajectory. And obviously that picks up the very strong growth that's taken place over the last few years. Now, I don't know if we wanted to cover it here or later on, but obviously we tried to model that and what the implications might be in terms of the housing need. And that came up to a figure of about 424 dwellings per annum to meet that high level of jobs growth. So that's just to meet the latest Experian baseline and factoring that high level of jobs growth. So a higher level than the 350, but not hugely higher, along the same trajectory, I would say.
Okay, thank you. So, and that those figures take a longer term view, would you say, in terms of looking at past trends and taking account of past trends?
Certainly, yeah. I mean, how Experian do it essentially is to look at the national growth forecast, national projections, and then they bring that down to each individual region, and they look at individual sectors and authorities that have a high proportion of say advanced manufacturing, and if that is doing well across the region, they tend to apply that as doing well in that particular local authority as well. That tends to be how the Experian projections factor up, and they also factor in consumption and availability of labour force, and factor in population projections as well. So, you know, we use Experian projections widely. We use Oxford Economics as well. Both tend to be found robust, and as you say, they tend to smooth out the ordinary business cycle of peaks and troughs. So you tend to get a fairly linear, straight line, but it's an overall up to the next 25 years, up to 2037.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Bolton.
Just quickly, we are banding about different projections at times over different time periods. And so I think we need to be careful. It gives you an extra job, if you like, if you need one, Mum, in terms of writing any interim conclusions that you take into account when you're looking at, if you like, the residual annual requirement. If you are taking into account job growth from, say, 2014, you need to also take into account the fact that some of that job growth has already occurred, and that some of the housing to meet that employment has already occurred as well. So you need to look at, when you look forward, if you like, from when the plan is adopted, you need to take into account the past levels of completions, especially if those have come forward and met, if you like, the employment or the housing requirements of the employment growth over that period. I think that's an important thing to do, because, as we pointed out, there's been quite a high level of housing completions on brownfield sites in the last few years, which would have met some of the high levels of employment growth in recent years.
I mean, just to get people's views, are you suggesting, Mr. Bolton, that to potentially, because some of the economic employment projections reflect past trends, that they could have picked up the employment growth that's already occurred over the last few years? Is that what you? Well,
yes, exactly, Mum. If you commission a employment growth or get an employment projection done, say December this last year or January this year, many of them will give you, if you like, dates, and we've heard this because the other participants, you will get, if you like, changes of employment within those projections for earlier years, and that's the only way someone can give you, as you've been given, an employment projection from 2014 to 2037. If that was produced this year, it is obviously using historical data to bring you up to the date when they start doing the projection effectively. And so they project from the date of the projection onwards, which is when they actually apply, do the projection part of what they're publishing. So if you're projecting employment from 2014, and before you take that to an annual or convert that to an annual dwelling requirement, you have to take into account the dwellings that have been built to meet that employment up to the point of the start of the projection, which, if there's one that's been produced in 2021, the first 6 years of completions need to be taken off the resulting number of jobs that come out of the employment projection. Basically what I'm saying is your start date for both jobs and employment has to be the same.
Yeah. Thank you, Mr. Bolton. Mr. Robinson?
Yeah, just on that, and obviously we've got a base date of 2014 that we've used in all the modelling and the experience forecasts. What I would say is that it's not like, I think one of the points someone else made earlier was at the time of the 2011 census, the labour force ratio or the commuting ratio was 1, i.e. jobs and the amount of people who are in employment in Halton was pretty much in balance. So the amount of people coming in was pretty much equal to the amount of people going out. What we've had a look at as part of our modelling work was how that's changed in recent years. We're actually seeing, even though they've done really well in terms of housing delivery, the amount of jobs that have been created has actually outpaced the amount of people who are living in the area. So that means that more and more people are actually commuting in. So it's actually getting further out of balance. And that's taken place over the last few years. And now there's about 10% more jobs than there are people living in the borough who are actually in employment. So it's not like, as Mr. Bolton seemed to be suggesting, well, it's all been in balance with housing and employment and it's all been covering its own back, so to speak, since 2014. It's actually getting further out of line. And if we just said, right, we're now taking 2020 and clearing the slate and just doing it from there, we'll have missed those years, in which case we haven't really been building quite enough homes. What have we been doing the last couple of years or so? But certainly from that period, from the recession, we really weren't. So by keeping the base date as 2014, you keep the alignment with the jobs and the housing need. And I think that needs to be taken forward over the full plan period.
Thank you, Mr. Robinson. Mr. Harper.
Thank you. I'm still losing track of what we're trying to achieve here in terms of housing requirement. Is that a supply or demand? Because we're talking about if we're trying to get our sort of residents, the people in Halton in employment, is that an objective we have, or is it to produce as much employment as possible and then justify the amount of housing we need to build? We've already discussed the fact that we've got people travelling from St Helens because they're at 1.2, aren't they, or something? So they're travelling to Halton maybe to work. But I mean, what are we trying to achieve? You can just say, oh yes, well we're looking to build as many houses as we need for our people that are currently here, but then we'll have as many jobs as we can get as well. So what's the balance? What is the objective? Surely we're looking at the people we've got and providing the environment for them, not necessarily getting as many jobs in as we can manage.
Thank you, Mr. Harper. Mr. Cross, in terms of that particular point, what is the council trying to achieve, I guess? I think picking up this point in sort of demand and supply, if you like, clearly on the basis of the current population projections, any growth in employment, which is clearly a strategy of the council, would need to be met by migration into the borough. So it is very much an employment-led strategy, if you like.
Yes, as I say, obviously the main thrust of the growth of the issue that we're dealing with in terms of the growth strategy is centred around the enterprise zone, which I say is one of two similar facilities across the country. It's of national importance. It is located where it is because it builds on the existing facility and the research facilities available on the site. So it's very much, I say, it's as a growth of an existing national asset. Admittedly, as well, I say obviously we are a member of the Liverpool City region, and we are committed to basically playing our part in delivering growth and prosperity across the city region. And obviously that does involve creating new jobs in order to generate that growth and prosperity. I say for years the borough has been a net exporter of population. The population projections now do show that it will be a modest importer of population over the coming years. That just seems to be the natural cycle of things.
Okay, thank you. And just coming back to sort of my original point on the principle of making a percentage reduction, I mean, the figures are mutually dependent in that the housing growth projection arose from the economic projections, and that was then translated into household projection. So the figures are mutually dependent in terms of making that percentage reduction, albeit it's I suppose, would you agree it's a crude adjustment, but there is logic, if you like, in that adjustment, as the figures are mutually dependent.
I'm sure the word I would prefer is proportionate. Proportionate,
not crude. I do apologise. I mean, obviously there are some concerns in relation to how that adjustment's been made, but it just sort of taking a step back, in principle, if the delivery on transformational sites is not progressing at the originally projected rate, there is an argument to reduce that, the housing delivery to meet that. But albeit I take on board views that, looking at the performance of the economy, there has been a pretty strong performance in Halton across the board, and therefore there are concerns that reducing the housing requirement would have an impact on the jobs delivery. So I'm not sure whether we're going to be able to square that circle today in terms of the discussion, and obviously that's something I will need to make a judgment on and go away and have a think about. But before we move on, I mean, are there any other points in relation to that particular aspect of the adjustments to the housing figure that the council's made? I'm not sure we can draw out the discussion really much further, but I've obviously heard your views on that. Just moving on, because I'm conscious of time. My next question really relates to how the revised economic growth assumptions align with the employment land requirement. Obviously, I'm treading on my colleagues' toes for tomorrow to a degree here, but clearly, as I understand it, the employment land requirement set out in CSR4 appears to be based on past completion trends as opposed to the baseline or growth scenario. Would that be correct, Mr. Cross?
So yes, it would. The figures from the Shelma did look at translating the jobs growth into a net land requirement, and the figures were probably about a third of the equivalent, or half to a third of the equivalent gross requirement calculated using past trends.
Sorry, just say that again, please.
As said, the Shelma obviously looked at the various ways of calculating the employment land requirement. It looked at the demographic need. It also looked at the translating the projected jobs growth. So jobs went to floor space, went to hectarage, and that basically produced a net requirement. It's summarised, or partly summarised, in Table 75 of the Shelma EL 014, and the figures are sort of like 28 hectares for B1, 20 hectares for B2, which is obviously orders of magnitude smaller than the past take-up, which is a gross figure, a gross requirement. So we are comparing apples and pears, but in terms of the requirement, yes, I see. We've gone with the gross because guidance clearly says we should go with the higher.
Yeah, and you're saying about comparing apples and pears. Just for me to get a feel, obviously you're basing the uplift in the housing requirement on the gross scenario minus the sort of deductions on for the transformation sites not coming forward fully. Just to get a feel really for where the employment land requirement sits in relation to the baseline and growth scenario. And obviously you say that the Shelmar figures are net, but your past completion trends figures in the housing requirement are gross, is that right?
No.
So how can you compare them? How can I get a feel for, where the employment land allocations sit in relation to the baseline growth scenario?
Well, effectively, the Shelma on the gross, the Shelma projected using the growth scenario that we required, totting it up there, it's about 70 hectares of employment land. Our employment land policy figure, proposed policy figure, is 180 hectares because it's a gross figure rather than net. The plan itself identifies, I think it's just shy of 180 hectares of employment sites. So as effectively, we've got a net requirement of, about 70 hectares, and we've got an identified supply of 180 hectares. I think it's quite clear that we've got sufficient land to meet the requirements.
Yeah, but in the 70 hectares of employment land in the Shelmar, would that be net or gross?
Net.
That would be net. And has the council sought to look at what their 180 hectares would mean in terms of a net figure to compare?
Well, they say the plan has identified 180 or just under 180 hectares of sites that are available for employment use to meet that 60 net demand. So we're clearly meeting the requirement.
Yeah, I think I was just trying to get a feel for. It's obviously, well, if you with gross employment land figures, you would obviously look at sort of including the roads and landscaping and things in that figure, wouldn't you?
Sorry, maybe there's a little confusion. The net and gross aren't net and gross site area in terms of the practical area that's covered by development. It's effectively the difference between the net and the gross is effectively the recycling or churn of previous employment sites coming back into employment use. So effectively, the Shelma, the net figure is the requirement for additional land. That's their estimate of the additional land that the plan needs to find to facilitate that employment growth. The past take-up basically accepts that obviously the supply will be made up of a contribution from new sites, but it will also be made up of a contribution from churn and recycling of existing sites. And obviously, as we discussed previously in the examination, particularly around South Widnes, a lot of the employment land has been in former employment use, so would fall into that churn category.
Okay, and taking the churn issue side, the 70%, the 70 hectare requirement of additional employment land, would that be net or gross in terms of the land use?
That would be net.
That would be net.
So it's basically 60 or 70 hectares uplift on the amount of land that is in employment use at present, or at the base state, sorry.
Okay, thank you. So obviously in terms of the transformational sites, those are allocated fully in the employment land policy. But obviously not all of those transformational sites would come forward on the basis of recent evidence.
I say that's the two sites. One site is partially implemented, and I say the second part could come forward at any point. The enterprise zone is progressing slower than anticipated, but it is showing progress. As I mentioned previously, the Tech Space 2 development was completed a couple of years ago, and I believe they're currently on site with what I think they're calling Project Violet, is currently under construction, and as they've got funding in place and are progressing with what I think is called Project Ultraviolet, which is the second part of that development. They will then be looking to effectively then spill over the canal to start developing out the remaining larger area of the site south of the Bridgewater Canal.
Okay. In terms of the employment land allocation, there's a 20% sort of buffer, as I understand.
Yes.
To effectively allow for flexibility and choice in the market. How does that compare to the sort of 5% margin that was looked at in terms of the Shalmar?
It's pretty similar. The Shalmar, basically, you say it applied actually applied a 5-year uplift on the net figures based on gross take-up, which is that was mixing apples and pears, but it was basically a 5-year past take-up figure they added on top, which over a 25, well, the Shalmar being a 25-year period, is effectively 20%.
Yeah, that's set out in the employment topic paper. I seem to remember reading.
Yeah, I don't think there's ever any science in the 20%. It's just custom and practice. Is what's always been done in this sub-region.
And other areas, in my experience. So if in terms of jobs growth, I don't think a revised jobs growth figure has been produced in terms of the allocation in policy CSR4, as I understand it. No,
effectively, again, we took a view in terms of effectively we compared the net requirements of about 60, 70 hectares with the gross requirements of about 180, and effectively concluded that there would have to be exponential growth in the net and the jobs numbers to generate the net requirement, effectively to increase it by a factor of 2 or 3. So there was no practical benefit in commissioning additional research at that time to re-quantify the net requirement.
Okay, and in terms of how, obviously you don't have an actual figure, but in terms of your judgment, where would you say that the employment land requirements set out in policy CSR4 in terms of potential jobs growth sits in relation to the baseline and growth scenario? Putting you on the spot again, sorry, Mr. Cross.
It can easily accommodate either the baseline or the growth scenario. So the net requirements from the growth scenario are about a third of the requirement identified by past take-up. So the net figure was significantly below the gross. So we're confident that there's not an issue with a shortage of employment land.
So it'd be fair to say that assuming all of those sites come forward, the jobs growth is more than likely to be, or could be above the jobs growth figure in the Shalmar?
That's a potential.
Okay. So it certainly sits more towards the growth scenario in terms of jobs growth.
Yeah.
Okay. Just any other views on that in terms of the relationship with the revised projections on those transformational sites and the employment allocation set out in policy CS4 R4 and the relationship between those two? No. I mean, yeah, Mr. Pollard.
Sorry, thanks. No, I think I'd agree with the council's observation there that it obviously provides flexibility and confidence that level of job growth at least could be provided. And when I say that level of job growth, that is the job growth under the growth scenario, so the over 12,000 jobs. Again, it comes back to that question of therefore the kind of rationale for reducing that in the context of a plan which is oriented towards growth, which is reflected in its approach to employment land, which again, we support the principle of a growth plan and making sure that there's sufficient flexibility in both employment land and housing land, but the two clearly are related.
Okay, thank you. Just coming back to Mr. Cross, do you consider that there is an overall strategy there that the housing requirement sits comfortably with the employment land requirement, and that the housing land requirement wouldn't necessarily constrain employment growth, given the sort of high level of growth being proposed in policy CSR4?
I'm tempted to say that if the 12,000 jobs growth that we've apparently achieved over the last 5 years is anything to go by, no, we do consider that, say, they're in balance, but we don't think that there's any constraint on the economy in terms of the housing figure, and equally we don't think that the economy itself will constrain the housing market. The plan is intended to be flexible. We have identified, about 180 hectares of currently vacant sites for future employment use. We've also identified a number of mixed-use areas where there's potential, and obviously, as mentioned or we discussed tomorrow, I'm sure, we have looked at the age of our current employment stock and identified that certain of the areas the employment estates are getting slightly pensionable, and we would naturally expect that units would be coming forward for redevelopment. The council does have a proactive regeneration team, and in certain areas where we know that the stock, because of its particular architectural styles, and I'm effectively referencing particularly the Newtown estate of Astmore, the units aren't particularly attractive to the market, and we are basically working. We've established a bid area within the area, and we are basically working with the landowners to basically see if there is a scope for pulling larger sites together to basically facilitate a bit more comprehensive clearance and replacement with more modern, attractive stock.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Harper.
I just wanted to make the point that there doesn't seem to be any constraint at all on the employment land. We just seem to be able to release hectare after hectare of essentially green fields for employment, and then demand the release of green belt for housing on the back of it. And it doesn't seem to be any balance at all. We just make as much land available as possible for employment. There's no control, there's no balance. But is that just normal in this situation?
Mr. Cross?
We would probably counter that. We'll probably, if we limit this, if we initially consider witness, the employment land that's being proposed in witness, I don't think that we're proposing as any new greenfield sites that weren't included in a previous plan, probably the unitary development plan. The largest site is the site HBC Fields, which is the site that's partly occupied by Alstom. That's a very long-standing commitment. The reason that it took so long probably to bring to market is that we had to negotiate funding to provide a new road over the Liverpool spur of the West Coast Main Line. And if anyone knows the joys of dealing with Network Rail, that was an achievement in itself. But that site was brought forward, including providing new railway sidings to make sure it was rail accessible. Other than that, there are a couple of greenfield sites remaining to the eastern side, up near to basically on the side of close to Fiddler's Ferry. Again, they are long-standing allocations. They were certainly I think in the Unitary Development Plan. So that basically shows they're going back to 2005. Indeed, one of the sites we were looking at the possibility of allowing a residential development, and the neighbouring industrial concern took umbrage, threatened us with legal action, and actually purchased the site in order to sterilise it from going for residential use. So, say the sites that we are promoting are clearly employment sites or employment areas. There's very little additional greenfield. The vast majority of it is the recycling of previously developed employment land, most of which, or a large proportion of which, does have, a certain degree, if not, either slight to severe contamination, and some of the sites are only suitable for an employment end use.
Okay, thank you. Just on the point I raised about the whether the housing requirement would support the jobs growth or constrain it, I'd just like to open up discussion on that if anyone has any other points. I know a number of participants are sort of arguing for a higher housing figure to support the jobs growth. Ms. Harding.
Thank you. Yes, I do think it's important to get that balance right and ensure that there are sufficient homes to meet that employment need. I think Mr. Robinson very early on in the session set out what we said in the NPPF about ensuring that there aren't constraints to employment. And one of those is in terms of the homes available. So I think that is an important factor to consider. I also think it's important to note that whilst we're saying that the transformational projects are slowed in terms of their delivery, obviously they're still being allocated. So there isn't a reason why potentially if demand arose to use, say, Daresbury's supercomputer, that the site couldn't come forward. So they're not sort of restricting the developments of those sites if an appropriate development came forward. So they're creating the flexibility in terms of bringing the employment forward. But it doesn't necessarily have that equivalent in terms of the housing requirement. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Any other points on that in terms of housing and the relationship with employment? Okay, thank you. Hang on. Mr. Pollard, nearly missed you there.
Sorry. No, yeah, I guess my concern here is that the confirmation that the proposed level of housing will support the level of job growth that we're talking about, even where it's adjusted, etc. It's just back of my mind that, even the Shelmer, I think the baseline scenario was talking a level of housing to support less than 4,000 jobs over the plan period, which is not too dissimilar from where we are now. And if we're moving the demographic changes and adjustments, it doesn't sit particularly comfortably that we can support the level of job growth that's clearly being aspired to, the growth strategy of the council in terms of the transformational sites and its wider plan overall. And I guess that there's a point here in terms of there isn't updated modelling in front of us prepared by the council, and perhaps there's something to come to at the end. But I know in the Lichfield's representations and the modelling that has been presented there, I might be wrong here, but it looks like in the conclusions there paragraph 5.1, the implication that 424 homes would support less than 5,000 jobs from 2020. Again, that would kind of chime with the Shelmer's baseline scenario, the point that, you know, this level of housing isn't going to support the level of job growth that I think the strategy is aiming for, quite rightly. And, you know, clearly it has a growth strategy, which is, as it's noted, funded. So I think it's just a lack of compelling evidence that it has been fully considered across, and as noted in relation to the MPPF, and particularly that paragraph 81.
Yeah, thank you. Mr. Hunter.
Sorry, thank you, Madam. No, I just wanted to say, I don't know, maybe how I was reading things, I may have misread it, but the way people were talking sometimes, you've got to remember that the housing requirement is a need figure. That is the amount of housing needed demographically and on the basis of assumptions about growth. The employment allocations, the totality of those are not a need figure, as Mr. Cross has said. They're over provision for the level of anticipated need, so they're there for flexibility and for all sorts of other contingencies. So you've got to be careful about saying we are planning for 180 hectares of employment growth. That's not right. We are providing flexibility for that should it be needed. And obviously there'll be some sites that turn out not to be as deliverable as we thought they were. But it's not apples and pears, and it's wrong to say, well, because you're planning for 180 and therefore that ought to be reflected in the housing need figures. They're different things. It's about the provision and availability of employment land in order not to constrain employment growth versus actually what we think employment growth will be, which is reflected in the housing need figure.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Hunter. I take the point. Obviously, with employment land, tend to generally more over allocate to provide that flexibility and choice, but there does need to be some synergy, I think, between housing and employment in terms of the overall strategy. Just, I think I've skipped a point on the agenda about whether the adjusted economic growth assumptions upon which a housing requirement is based deliverable. I think, just conscious of time again, from the discussions we've had, I think I know what the answer to that question would be in terms of there being a sort of a pretty buoyant economy, and that, you know, certainly the economy has been performing well in recent years. And I think most participants would agree that there is a sort of a realistic prospect of those growth assumptions coming forward, other than the adjustments obviously on the transformational sites, as we've discussed today. I mean, that's just my summary in terms of the discussion we've had today. If anyone has a dissenting view to that or wants to add to that, would you like to do so now? Or is that a fair summary? Mr. Bolton.
I think it is a fair summary of where we are, but I think there is, if you like, the issue about the transformation sites and the way the council have gone about using that, if you like, to justify the uplift. And you need to come to a conclusion, if you like, on whether or not that is a sound basis on which to proceed. And obviously, my clients have a lot of sympathy with the position being espoused by Mr. Harper, in that it does seem to be almost a circular argument in terms of identifying land for growth, for employment growth, which then drives housing growth to support it. And I suppose from their point of view is there could be an alternative strategy. Now, whether or not their strategy overall is sound will come down to debates about the impact of what these numbers are, which you'll be having over the next couple of days.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Cross, anything to add before we move on? Mr. Robinson, has his hand up. Mr. Robinson.
Yes, thank you. Sorry, I don't think the council should be penalised for going for growth. I mean, again, the MPPF, paragraph 80 said significant weight should be placed in the need to support economic growth and productivity. You know, the government is very keen to see the north levelling up and catch up with the wider southeast and London. And part of that is about increasing jobs, providing an acceleration of productivity. And part of that is going to be providing new employment land and good quality employment land in accessible locations, but also with the link about housing growth. And I think that's what the council is trying to do. We've heard from them about increasing the housing need to do that. And whilst I think we've got some concerns about how they've come to the 350, I think generally we feel, you know, that should be the minimum, and there's probably scope for going above that, which I don't know if we'll come on to later. But again, modelling the latest projections could be over around 424 dwellings per annum, again having that link with latest job growth. But I think fundamentally they should be that they're doing the right thing in going for growth, and that's in line with national policy.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Robinson. Mr. Cross, did you have anything to add to that?
No, I was just going to say that before you draw the session to a close, I think my colleague Catherine sat in the background with the shopping list of our homework, but she probably want to run through just to check that we've captured everything.
That's fine. We're nearly there, Mr. Cross, but not quite, because we have just to look at the migration issue and economically active or inactive households and how that assumption has been made. So if you can just hang on a bit longer, I appreciate it's been a long day for you. Can you just sort of set out really how you've approached the adjustments to the figure, which obviously you've kept that adjustment in your revised set of figures, and why you feel it's appropriate to include that in the adjustment?
It's effectively probably a bit like the double jobbing sort of issue that the Shalma appears to have applied the occupation of the existing housing stock to basically identify how many houses you'd have to build, how many houses you currently have to generate X number of workers, and therefore if there's an uplift in Y number of workers, you buy the same proportion to the number of houses that you require. Effectively what we're saying is because we're clearly above the demographic figure, we're meeting our locally rising demographic need and pushing into potentially, in migration, that it's unreasonable to make an allowance that we will build for every 10 houses that we provide, 2 will be expected to be taken by an economically inactive pensioner households. So we basically had a look at the age structure of the in-migrants, and I think it's quite clear and quite obvious that we're not Brighton, Southport, or wherever it is that people choose to retire to. We're not one of those localities, and that in migration from households that are likely to be economically inactive is not representative of the proportion that they appear in the currently residential population, and therefore it seems appropriate to apply an allowance to try and strip out that over provision, if you like, within the housing requirement for in-migrant households.
And my understanding of the Shalma kind of kept the profile of migrants moving into the area the same as kind of reflected the demographic profile of the existing population. And what you're saying is that people moving into the area tend to be more within the economically active age group.
Yes. And again, we have applied certain assumptions. We have provided a little bit more detail in terms of the profile of the economically activity in households. The figures that we applied was 25%. Again, there's no great science in that. It sort of seemed to be a conservative estimate. Again, we were trying not to over-egg the discounting whenever we were going through this process and trying to assess the likely impact on the changes on the base figure that we were starting with, which was the Shelma, in order to then assess the likely need for uplift over the standard method.
Okay, thank you. And obviously, in response to my request, you provided additional information in the forms of the tables, just to save me going through all of the ONS tables. Can I just clarify on Appendix 1, just in terms of the time periods and the dates and the sort of source data arising from that table? Can you just expand on that?
Certainly. I think earlier in the paper I provided the links to where you can download the actual original data. It's ONS data supporting the population projections. I was conscious that in my previous paper I basically provided the breakdown or the picture for a single year, provided the data for 2018. Which if I was a suspicious type of you could argue that it was cherry picked, in order to reassure you that we hadn't cherry picked and the profile's very much the same. What we actually did is we downloaded the most recent data and we've taken the average of the in migrants and out migrants for the full plan period from 2014 to 2037.
So the figures on the left-hand side of the table, the sort of from 0 to that's the age groups, isn't it? So
that's the individual years of age.
That's the individual, yeah. Yes. So how does that table relate to the sort of the data sets and the actual? Is that a snapshot in time at 2018?
It's the average of the projected migration, because the migration figures are provided for single years of age for each year that is covered by the population projections. So effectively, the 2018 base data is available from 2019. So I have had to use 2016 base for a couple of the earlier years and think of 1 year of 2014 base just to get the full spread of the plan period. But effectively it's tabulated in a spreadsheet, and those figures are the average number of migrants in that age range for that particular category of migration. That's the average for the year 2014 to 2037.
Okay, so it's based on the various projections, data sets. That's what
I was going to provide it as an appendix, but obviously there's six individual data sets plus the aggregation. You're looking at 1,000-row spreadsheet.
Yeah. Okay. I think
Which
it might
quite
just
small for one of mine.
another person obsessed with spreadsheets. It might just help to have a little note on to explain that the table, for those of us who are less familiar with spreadsheets, in terms of just the fact that it is an average. I hadn't sort of appreciated that of those age groups in terms of the projections, and I think that would just be useful just to get a bit more explanatory summary, if you like, on that table in terms of how it was produced to aid my deliberations. So in terms of the data, you're saying there's evidence there to support that assumption. And I mean, obviously those groups would account for around 45%. But you've kind of made a planning judgment, if you like, in reaching that 25% figure. So I would just like to open up discussion on this particular point in terms of the principle of making an adjustment to reflect the fact that the migrant population are more economically active than the existing population, and then also in terms of how that 25% has been arrived at. Who would like to go first? I know there have been a few comments on that adjustment. Is everyone running out of steam? Mr. Pollard.
So I'll chip in. I think you've got it in our hearing statements. Essentially, yeah, I think we're not comfortable with this as an adjustment on top of where we're adjusting jobs down based on the Shelmer evidence base. I think one of the fundamental concerns I've got here is if we're using the Shelmer, we can't just pick out bits we don't want to use from it. The Shelmer's method, as we said before, has been deployed widely, consistently in post standard method and as well as pre-standard method kind of approaches to evidencing housing needs. So it's not something I've seen before where we just decide to take a housing need figure and a calculation and then just adjust parts of it we don't want to use. We set out in paragraph 2.26 some of the reasons why of our hearing statement why we think such an approach isn't robust, not least because well, there's no control over who moves into houses. First off, you can't just pick that it will be economically active people moving into the homes, and also it doesn't allow for any assumptions around why people migrate into a borough. It might be that they're moving in for jobs, but it might also be that they bring dependents or households split up, their children age, require households through the plan period, etc., none of which is taken into account by that kind of adjustment. So I just think, whereas badged as a planning judgment, it's just not appropriate. I think it kind of comes back into this question of where the adjustments are being applied. So if the standard method is dealing with demographic aspects and this is about jobs uplift, how does this fit into that? Because it seems to be moving into a demographic adjustment again being applied. So there's a risk of double counting, of netting things off here, would be my view.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Usher.
Thank you, Mark. Just to add to what Mr. Pollard said, really, we're not particularly comfortable with it. I think really and truly this, to take in the full range of underlying assumptions, this needs to be looked at in a demographic modelling process to, so that we can take into account the relevant economic activity rates and fertility rates, mortality rates and migration rates as well, to give us that robust picture.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Robinson.
Yes, thank you. I mean, I particularly agree with what Mr. Pollard's saying. I mean, the Shelmer doesn't do that approach. The Shelmer assumes that there's going to be a proportion of people who move into the area that aren't going to be taking up those jobs, and it's fairly standard practice that you do that. I think the point is, however, it doesn't have a huge impact on the council's calculations. So if we go back to their table on page 3 of matter 4A, if we assume that we don't make that 25% adjustment, we just keep it at 100%, and we go with that 49.5% being the more accurate one, then that only increases the need from 354 to 383. So it's that 29 dwellings per annum. So it is an upward adjustment, but it's not of a huge magnitude. That's the point I want to make on that.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Bolton.
Yes, just quickly. The adjustment that has been made, firstly, we go back to the point that the jobs-led figure is dependent upon jobs being or generated, if you like, by jobs being taken up onto specific sites. That's the present justification for them, and therefore the problem that the council then have is that the evidence base doesn't reflect what we suspect to be the case, which is that you have a different age sex profile now than you did when that evidence was being put together. And the adjustment that the council are making, and I have some sympathy with them for trying to do this, is to reflect that in more recent years, the profile of people moving into the or the net profile that people move, net effect, if you like, of people moving in and out of Holton is that the migration is increasing the working age population. So it's correct that should be reflected. But then I have some sympathy with the opponents to that, that if you're going to do that, don't do it on the back of a fag packet, which is effectively what's being done here. So, I mean, when I look at it, it comes down to the soundness of again, the soundness of what's being used and the evidence that's being used to justify this uplift. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Burton. Would Mr. Harper?
I just wanted to make the point that Mr. Robinson suggested that 29 dwellings per annum was peanuts, when actually that's over 700 homes on Greenbelt. So, I mean, peanuts to one and not peanuts to another, a village to another.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Harper. Mr. Cross, did you want to come back on some of the points raised in relation to that migration sort of discount?
Oh, I'm happy.
Okay, thank you. I'm sure you prefer the phrase use of planning judgment rather than the back of a fag packet, though. Mr. Hunter, yes.
Thank you, Matt. I'm probably treading into unsafe waters here because it's a matter for the experts on this. But there's some generic objections raised to the council's approach here, but it wasn't actually explained in detail why it's wrong. It sort of just said if you change the variable in one part of the model, you should rerun the whole model. That doesn't follow. If you know that there needs to be a reason why that's articulated, and it's not being articulated. If we know that certain assumptions were made about the economic activity in migrants, and we substitute a different figure for that for only a portion of the Shelmer growth scenario figure, which is what's being done, it's the 239. It's not clear to me, from at least from what I've heard, and not being a non-expert, so I speak with trepidation on it, why that isn't legitimate. We know there's a figure in there and assumptions being made about it. Mr. Cross has explained why we think that doesn't fit this area. Nobody said really, I think, that Mr. Cross is wrong about that in the substance. And if he's right, I certainly, standing back on the sidelines here, haven't heard an explanation why it necessarily means you need to rerun the whole model. And just to hark back what I said at the start, the government's guidance seems to assume that we are able to, we don't have to just model absolutely everything. We can use the evidence base that we have, including the modelling. And if it really is incumbent on those who say this is demonstrably unsound to explain to you why that is. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Easton.
Thank you, Mum. I think we're probably getting towards the end, and I was trying to choose an appropriate moment just to make some 3 short but broad points. Would now be convenient?
It would, yes.
Thank you very much. Mum, you'll see from our hearing statement that we're generally supportive of the council's approach and the figure that they have alighted upon, albeit that we wouldn't resist a higher figure. But almost to bookend the points that Mr. Hunter made in opening this morning, that really isn't the test, because there are potentially an unlimited number of sound housing requirements. But the only question that you and Mr. Troy need to address is whether the figure presented by the council is a sound one. So that's my first broad point. The second broad point, and I know this has been repeated on a number of occasions during the course of today, but it does bear repeating. The question of the housing requirement isn't a scientific exercise. Various statistics, economic projections and such like always form part of an exercise. And many of us have lost literally weeks of our lives talking about economic activity rates, migration and unattributed population change and the like. But ultimately the question, and this is supported by a number of authorities, both of the High Court and the Court of Appeal, is that the soundness of the housing requirement being promoted by a local planning authority is a question of planning judgment having regard to relevant policy and guidance, as well as a proportionate evidence base. So insofar as anybody has any concerns about the lawfulness of the council's approach, provided that the conclusion is reached that this is a sound approach based on proportionate evidence base having regard to policy and guidance, the likelihood of the planning court being interested in a challenge put forward on that basis, I think, is extremely limited indeed. Which leads me to my third broad point. Having listened to the various representatives during the course of today, it seems to me that the overarching point is not that the council's approach is fundamentally unsound, but rather, and I'll forgive me, Ma'am, but I'm going to go back to your teacher analogy this morning, what the council may not have done to the fullest possible extent is to show it's working. And I think that is a matter that is relatively easily resolved during the course of the examination. So, Ma'am, those are my three broad points, which I hope are helpful.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Easton. Mr. Burns.
Thank you. Just going back to the point made by Mr. Hunter, I deal with this matter in paragraph 2.6 of my written statement. Effectively, the Oxford Economics model is a closed model. You change one aspect of it, including the base date or the base data, it changes everything else. I speak from experience, having instructed similar companies with similar models. You change one thing, everything else changes, and then they charge you for that change. So as others have said, that is the reason why you can't cherry pick the data and just change certain inputs to it, because the other parts of the data set and the other parts of the model don't work anymore if you do that.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Harper.
Actually, it's Colleen this time. If I may speak, the previous gentleman said he wanted to give an overall view of certain things, and perhaps I could do the same thing as a result of the discussions today. And we speak as lifelong residents of Widnes, and of North Widnes particularly, since 1979, and we're very disappointed that Halton Borough Council want to follow their figures for housing and everything else, because they don't seem to take into account at all the views of the residents. There's this forecast and there's that forecast, but what do they ask the residents that they want? In my opinion, Mr. Cross has confirmed that Widnes is intended to be a dormitory town. There's to be an increase in jobs and houses, well, the jobs mostly in the Daresbury area. So there's no justification for use of the green belt in Widnes. I know some of these points are going to be covered elsewhere as well, but there is very little greenery in the North Widnes area. And the council seems to be intent on crushing what little bit there is already. COVID has proved people like to go for a walk, and where do you go for a walk in North Widnes that's not already covered in houses and roads and the pollution therefrom? They've not sort of mentioned any improvements in the infrastructure, particularly of schools, which is going to be very important if you're talking about trying to attract families with school-age children. We've already got children from Widnes going to schools in St Helens, Warrington, and even the Runcorn schools are over the 3 miles distance, so it's going to be a cost of transport to the council. And we're going to be a net importer as well. That's not good. And as we'll see in later discussions, windfalls have not been taken into account. I think Mr Bolton touched on this. How many houses have already been built? In fact, we're already at 66 windfalls for 2021. We're only in the middle of March, and that doesn't include the HMOs and the care homes that have been applied for. So I would also point out from our planning applications that during 2020 and 2021, people haven't been able to go on holiday, and it's an enormous number of people putting extensions on their own homes. And of course, a lot of people are working from home nowadays, so maybe they need the extra office space or whatever. And we've got to ask whether that's going to change. Are we going to go back to people travelling to offices, or will there be a lot more home working? Halton Borough Council say they can't build houses on contaminated land, so we're only going to be using it for employment purposes. But if I've understood the numbers correctly, you've got almost 3 times more than you need in the plan. And yet, Halton Borough Council prides itself on being a specialist borough in dealing with contaminated land, and I don't think that should be overlooked. It's a possibility. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Harper, Mrs. Harper, sorry. It's been a long day. Mr. Cross, are there any of those points you want to come back to?
Obviously, the windfall issue is a supply side, and we're talking about demand side today. So I'm quite certain that the windfall will be discussed whenever we're talking about how we meet the housing requirement. In terms of the characterisation of trying to turn Widnes into a dormitory town, obviously that's not a characterisation we recognise or accept. In terms of the contamination, yes, there are different sites, and I think I have indicated previously, I think it was yesterday, I used an example of the redevelopment of a former asbestos factory. So yes, we do have a good record of bringing brownfield sites back into use, some of which are suitable for residential purposes, others aren't. The site that you will be pointed to at some point, I'm certain, in the probably weeks 3 or 4 of the examination, is the what's known as the Carousel golf course site. A number of parties are suggesting that that's suitable for housing following extensive decontamination. That's a site that was decontaminated, I think, using derelict land grant. How many years ago does that put it? And was basically remediated, so it was fit for a green end use, and the council developed a golf course on there. Subsequently, arsenic started leaching out of the ground again, and it had to be closed for public safety. And effectively were advised that the only way that site can be brought forward would be effectively to excavate all the contaminated material off site and import replacement, which makes the site completely unfeasible for development.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Cross. We are nearing the end, so just bear with me. But there are a couple of questions I think yet to cover, which I'm determined to get through. So just humour me for a few more minutes. In terms of the past delivery, obviously the PPG indicates that sort of stronger levels of past housing delivery could indicate a reason to go above the sort of standard methodology figure. And can you just sort of set out the sort of the position in relation to previous levels of delivery in the borough?
I think there was a chart previously in SD32 that showed past delivery. It didn't have numbers, and it certainly didn't have the averages, so I've appended that to the most recent submission. It's a chart under paragraph 4.2, which shows the net completion net dwelling gain over the period from 2003 to 2019. It shows that at 2018, the average, long-term average delivery had been 375 units per annum. So in the same sort of ballpark that we're currently looking at. I would draw your attention to the note at the bottom of that chart in relation to the 2019-20 figures, which shows completions of 600. That was a 16-month period due to COVID. We were 4 months late going out to do our survey work. So pro rata, that would suggest that figure would probably be about 450. And another point, which I'm not going to labour, but I'll just put out there, is that the 2018-19 figure also was significantly boosted by an office to residential conversion under PD rights, which I believe delivered 274 units. I checked with council tax last week, and basically 3 years from completion, 25% are still shown as unoccupied, suggesting that there is a limit for the market to absorb that particular segment of properties. So if they are shown and the completions, I think effectively the market has struggled to absorb those units.
Okay, thank you. There did seem to be some different figures floating around there from various parties in terms of completion figures, but presumably that's the most up-to-date position that you've set out in the latest document. Okay, thank you. Mr. Gorbett?
Thank you, ma'am. Like Mr. Easton, I was sort of looking for my chance to jump in, and to use your school analogy, I've been sitting diligently on my hands all day. I just wanted to summarise when we're looking at the. I know your agenda goes on to what alternatives there might be, and whether or not the housing requirement is suitable for it to be uplifted over standard method. And it seems you don't have an easy task on your hand with this examination, ma'am. I think we're all clear that the starting point for this planning process under this NPPF is the standard method. And I think my colleagues in the room and across this half of the country have got quite a lot of difficulties with the standard method and what it does to housing growth in the north generally. That's not the subject of this examination. But what the government has done as a remedy to that, I think those criticisms are quite well voiced nationally. The government, as Mr. Usher said earlier in the day, the government has allowed for a very stringent test, a very difficult test to pass for a borough to go below that standard method, but a relatively easy test to pass to go above that method, above that figure. And what isn't required is a rerunning of what would have been an old OEN calculation. It doesn't require the redoing of all the work that's contained in the Shelmer. Now, what it appears to talk simply about it, ma'am, what it appears the council has done has picked one distinct element of the old modelling exercise in its transformational sites, and it has sought to set out to you an uplift that's appropriate to add on to the OEN. And much of the criticism, what it doesn't do is seek to rerun the modelling exercise, and much of the criticism that's been levelled at the council's approach essentially boils down to the fact that it doesn't comprise a complete redo of the modelling exercise. Now, Mr. Bolton would have you believe that because it doesn't redo all of that work, that it's then unsound and should be thrown in the bin with a reversion back to the standard method. If you look at our other colleagues and what they've done, they have, or many of them have looked at what happens if you essentially update the Shelmer or rerun the modelling. And they've demonstrated actually that far from going back to a standard method level of growth, that most roads point to an increased level of need from what the council has brought forward. And to go back to sort of Mr. Hunter's point that the council, and a point that we support, that all the council needs to do really is to demonstrate that its approach is sound, not that it's, and the planning guidance doesn't require, as I said, doesn't require it to redo all of the work that it would normally have to do under an OEN. It just has to show, in essence, a robust reason or a reasonable reason for going above the standard OEN, which I think the council has achieved. But if it hasn't achieved that, all of the other evidence that's been presented to you through, aside from Mr. Bolton's evidence, suggests that again all roads point to a housing requirement that's above the 350. We argue that the 350 dwellings per annum sits towards the lower end of the range of work. If you were to redo the work, that 350 is towards the lower end of the range, but still conclude that it's sound. And the reason I bring this point up here, ma'am, is that one of those indicators that shows that 350 is, or that there are plenty of reasons why we can go above the standard method, and one of them is past delivery and the NPPF's requirement to boost significantly the supply of housing. So those are my points on how you get to the figure. I think in answering the question of whether or not the approach that's been taken is robust, ma'am, I don't see the benefit in putting to one side the council's approach that it's taken now and seeking to rerun all of this work that's not required by the council. That the council have brought us to a figure that I think most agree is reasonable. if not towards the lower end. That's everything for me. Thanks, Mark.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Gilbert. Mr. Bolton.
Thank you, Ma'am. And I'll deal particularly with the points you've asked with regard to past completion rates. Yes, past completion rates can be a reason to increase dwelling requirement. However, in this case, I think it is pertinent to note that has the increase in delivery rates has appears to be, when you look at it, driven by a substantial rate of delivery on previously developed land. 8 out of the last 10 years, brownfield completions have exceeded greenfield completions. And 7 out of the last 10 years, brownfield sites have delivered over 200 dwellings per annum. So that's the background, if you like, to those high levels. Now, you just don't take the high levels and take them forward. You have to have a reason to do so. And, you know, when you come to look at sites in the future, as you will do, one of the questions you'll be asking yourself is, you know, can that level of brownfield completions be repeated? And if not, should it be replaced, if you like, with greenfield and greenbelt completions? The point's being made about, I'm saying you should, you know, one can't accept the figure because it needs to be completely rerun. That kind of slightly underemphasizes the points I've made. What I've done is I've gone through in my written response and quite carefully identified why I think the submitted plan, because that's what we're examining, is unsound based on the submitted evidence. I think that's clear, and certainly I think most people around the virtual table aren't making the case that the 350 is robustly supported by a clear and consistent and cogent evidence base. In fact, my reading of most of the objectives' evidence is that it isn't. We're just pointing in different directions in terms of what you do next. And I'm just saying the evidence is not proportionate, and it's not sound in order to justify the 350, which I think is fairly clear.
Thank you, Mr. Bolton. Ms. Harding.
Thank you. I did set out in my hearing paper my thoughts on the housing delivery, but I just wanted to re-emphasise it. Basically just saying that I think it's quite clear over the last 10-year period, and particularly over the last 5-year period and the period since the core strategy was adopted, that actually Halton have been delivering significantly over and above those 350 dwellings per annum that they're currently proposing. It looks comfortably like the 552 dwellings per annum that were identified in the core strategy is actually deliverable across Halton, where there is sites available, where there is land available. I don't think there's been any evidence to suggest that that couldn't continue to come forward. I also think that given Halton's regeneration strategies for some of the areas, there's no reason why some brownfield sites couldn't continue to come forward too. Things like the Healthy New Town around the shopping city, things like Runcorn Old Town redevelopment around the station quarter. There aren't reasons why brownfield sites associated with those couldn't continue to come forward, as well as a mix of the greenfield sites that are allocated.
Thank you. Mr. Harper or Mrs. Harper?
It's Mr. Harper again. I just wanted to maybe make a point or ask a question. That if the standard model is addressing demographic need and each local authority applies that, if you go above that requirement, you are going to, by definition, take housing requirement from an alternative local authority. Now, if you continue to deliver significantly higher than the standard model identifies, then you should have an agreement with another local authority that you're taking some of their demand. Is that not true, or am I missing something somewhere?
I shall ask Mr. Cross to address that point in terms of the city region approach.
as we discussed, was it yesterday? I said we're constantly in discussions or talking to our neighbours. None of the neighbours have asked us to take any of their additional housing. We basically, and they're all satisfied that we're planning to meet our own needs. The wider point about the standard method. The standard method does have provisions for capping increases across the country. I think it's only the most recent figures or the proposed changes that government have made that are actually getting them to the fabled 330,000 across the country that they feel they need. I say but to quote a phrase from a former colleague, we are where we are. The government has set out this requirement, this method. That's their preferred approach, and we are but minions, and we follow the instructions of our masters.
Mr. Burns. Mr. Burns, do you want to unmute yourself?
It was a very good point I was making as well. You'll have to take my word for it. Yeah, I think the evidence is quite clear that Halton have been very successful in housing delivery in recent years, and I think it's important to know that though that 10-year figure does include figures where Halton was particularly badly affected by the recession, and I think we'd all hope that was a recession that is as close to once in a generation as it can possibly be. So it's important that oddities and anomalies like that aren't actually locked in to the system. I think it's also important to look at previous housing requirements. Obviously, you've got the core strategy with a housing requirement of 552, and before that, the RSS with housing requirement of 500 from memory for Halton. So actually going to 350 is a huge drop for the borough at a time where housing delivery is high. Yet we are supposed to be significantly boosting the supply of housing. I think just picking up on a couple of points that Ian, if you don't mind, Ma'am, that Mr. Gilbert made, earlier. Everything I've tried to say and a lot of our written statement has unfortunately been taken up with this issue that the council and the approach that the council took in terms of the evidence that they have presented, in order to try and point you in the direction that the Shelmer economic growth scenario was an overestimation of likely economic growth and therefore likely housing need associated with that growth. I think what is quite clear from our evidence and also the evidence of a number of other parties is that actually Shelmer economic growth scenario is probably underestimating actually the economic growth that has been and could be delivered in Halton. So I would leave you with my thoughts of that is the case, and rather than being an underestimation, it is at the very least a realistic delivery of economic growth and housing growth. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Goss, I just wanted to ask you, it was a point made by, I think, Mr. Bolton and Mr. Harper as well, in terms of sort of past delivery of housing. I think it was suggested that since 2014, quite a significant proportion of the housing requirement has actually already been met. And I think the suggestion, correct me if I'm wrong, was that therefore you don't need to plan for as much housing, in future years. I mean, obviously we're getting into the supply side argument there, but can I just have your views on that particular point? I don't think it's really been raised today.
Obviously, the figure is proposed as a net dwelling requirement over the plan period. So if it has a net requirement from 2014, then completions that have already been delivered from the start of the plan period will be netted off of the remaining requirement. It wouldn't change how it was expressed in terms of the policy. Sorry, to avoid any doubt, the policy would be expressed as X hectares per X dwellings per annum. But obviously, going forward in terms of delivery, we would count completions to date against that.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. And we're very nearly there. Very nearly there. Obviously, you've presented an alternative scenario, if you like, in terms of how you've arrived at the housing requirement figure in terms of the revised table, which produces a figure of 354. So coming back to my earlier question, I guess, is that a change in the council's position? Is that the figure that the council want myself and Mr. Try to consider, or is it just an alternative option to the figure already presented?
As I said, it was in reaction to the questions raised, and particularly the questioning of the amendments to potential amendments of the application of demographic amendments to an economic figure. We basically thought we'll try and strip it out because it is getting very complicated and convoluted. So we went back just to straight first principles, standard method, what is the actual uplift that it should be looking at, and say the figures that we have available to us are the figures from the SHELMA, which is the growth uplift minus the baseline. That is effectively the uplift from the economic strategy, and then we've applied a discounting to that. Obviously, you have asked for additional information in regards to the delivery of the strategic sites. We will try and get that, and I'm sure that will probably colour your judgment on the actual number of jobs that are likely to be developed as part of that growth strategy, and that will no doubt inform the final conclusion on the housing number. So, yes, I say that's probably a convoluted way to say, like, yes, I think that would probably be your starting point.
And just coming back to one of my specific questions, the original calculation suggested a sort of an uplift of 120, and then the council applied an uplift figure of 85. And now that question may well be superseded by subsequent discussions, but can you just briefly sort of say why you chose 85 as opposed to 120? Did you have in the back of your mind the figures that we've now been presented in terms of the delivery on transformation sites?
Certainly, yes. I say we did have that in mind. We knew that we considered we'd been cautious in the amendments that we'd made to try to work out what the SHELMA would probably be telling us today. I say we were also mindful of the fact that the standard method figure is falling away at about 10 units per annum. So we had, obviously we've got the upward pressure for the fact that we do have the enterprise zone, we do have the transformational sites. Against that, we had the sort of balance in the downward pressure and the base, the standard method figure, and the fact that we knew that we'd been quite cautious we considered being quite cautious in terms of our adjustments. So on balance, we thought 350 struck a reasonable balance in terms of projecting the plan forward. And as I have mentioned before, I say we haven't introduced any phasing element to the plan. So we think that does ensure that it's flexible and it will not limit, it won't hinder housing development, and equally it won't hinder housing development support to the economy.
Okay, thank you. And Mr. Pollard.
Thank you, Ma'am. I think just some final observations for me, and I think in terms of reflecting on obviously that table which only came out this week and steering towards the 354 as opposed to the council's 350 figure, it's probably just worth reflecting on that is where that sits in terms of the Shelmer's own scenarios of need. So the growth scenario at 565 is obviously considerably above that. The 354 actually comes out very close to the Shelmer's economic baseline. So I mean, from the discussions today, the fundamental difference seems to be an adjustment down of the transformational delivery of the transformational projects, and that's quite a big difference, would be my observation on that. And I think just going back to full circle on the start of the day, really, and I thank Mr. Easton for his corrections on my language around the green belt and the adequacy tests, etc. But I think overall, my concern remains through today in terms of the approach taken by the council, whether it passes the test of it being adequate evidence to support such a big departure from its own evidenced need, is one, obviously, a judgment for you to make. I think through the discussions today, it's been pretty apparent that there is a very good reason why the figure is higher. You know, clearly it's set out, council has set out a PSD 02, paragraph 6.5. It's growth deal with the Liverpool City region, the funding that exists, and with the job figures we've been talking about today, doesn't suggest in any suggestion that it's that's fallen off a cliff, nor its prospects have for the next 15 years. I think it's worth, if you are looking back, I've signposted a number of times the document EL 100. It's worth going to the conclusion on that, which is only a short document, but that quite clearly sets out the consequences of getting it wrong in terms of not balancing the employment and housing strategies. Obviously, that's written across the city region, but by inference it's for each authority as well, and that is quite clear in terms of those implications around issues around housing affordability, congestion, etc. So I mean that would be comments from me, really, but I think it was outlined before, it's not an easy task you've got in front of you in terms of that, and I think hopefully I'm sure we'll run through the actions for the council, but hopefully some of that will help to clarify, although my concern might be that they've had quite a number of attempts to make clarifications as to the approach they've taken. So we'll wait and see what that comes back with.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Pard. Mr. Hunter.
Thank you, Madam. Just 2 points. On the 350 versus 354, Madam, I think I know Mr. Cross has commented on this and sort of said, well, we took into account downward issues in relation to the demographics and standard method and so on as well. But, Madam, I just caution against, I think the other point is really that one can strive for a spurious level of scientific accuracy, sort of echoing what Mr. Easton said here. So even in the old OAN world, one would frequently find consultants saying, well, this is what one scenario, what one model produces. If we look at a different model or a different scenario, we get a different figure. And they would frequently say it's somewhere in the range. And that was a totally acceptable approach. Again, a matter of planning judgment, as Mr. Easton said at the end. And I think particularly that's true where we're looking at very small differences like 354 and 350. In reality, no one can predict, and these models don't purport to predict that with that level of accuracy. The second point, Madam, I just go back to the test in the guidance here, because obviously we focused a lot on economic growth because the uplift is about economic growth, or largely about economic growth. But if we go back to paragraph 15 of the guidance on housing and economic assessments, just to remind, the two, I think it was referred in the housing topic paper as 2 tests. I'm not sure they're tests, but the 2 things that you have to adequately reflect in order to get the benefit of the presumption that your approach can be considered sound because it exceeds the minimum starting point are not economic. They are current and future demographic trends and market signals, or they're not directly economic. And it's not precisely reflects, it's adequately reflects. So there's plenty of flexibility in there. So so I just ask you, Madam, when you're thinking about this, ultimately, you turn back to what the guidance says the approach is to be taken. And if you conclude we've done that, the 2 things there, then there's no reason not to conclude that it's reasonable to conclude that the figure is sound. And that in the sense that a lot of criticism about the vagueness or the informality of not rerunning the model fall by the wayside, because that's not what the guidance seeks to do anymore. Yes, there's got to be synergy. I fully agree, Madam, with what you said. To some extent, synergy between economic growth and housing, the planning for housing. But it is not a strict link. It is not a strict link. It's been fundamentally loosened in the latest iteration of national policy and guidance. And those are just the points I wanted to make at the end. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Hunter. Mr. Robinson.
Thank you, Mum. Just a very quick summing up from me. I'd be glad to know. So, obviously gone into an awful lot of detail today, which has been good on one side, but equally I don't want to make sure we can't see the wood for the trees from the message that we're trying to put across. And I think whilst generally I think it's clear to say that we're supportive of the council's 350 dwellings per annum figure. We do think that's evidenced. However, we think that's the absolute minimum that would be required. And I know Mr. Hunter has just said that that relationship with housing and economic growth has been loosened. That's true, but it's still there. And I think the council is right to try and make that link. Again, we've provided plenty of economic evidence in our representations about if you wanted to understand the link between the latest projections, but also the latest economic forecast, then an uplift could be justified up to potentially 424 dwellings per annum. So the evidence is there if you felt that uplift would be justified. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Robinson. Just checking back on my original questions, I think we've probably covered most of those, but just in terms of summing up, I shall start with the council. In overall terms, is the housing requirement of 8,050 or 350 dwellings per annum appropriate and justified, and is there a basis to arrive at an alternative figure? I think we have covered a lot of those points, but would you like to sort of reach a conclusion on that answer?
Yes, I mean, obviously the council considers that it is reasonable. We consider that it is justified. Equally, say that could we have arrived at a different figure if we had chosen, if we considered it appropriate to commission new research, then obviously you just have to look at the difference between the outputs, the baseline figure from the Shelma and the figure, which is effectively the comparable figure from the SHMA, shows that the same consultants running the same model about one or 2 years apart can come out with some very different figures.
Thank you. It's not an exact science, as has been pointed out. Any other sort of closing points there? Mr. Robinson.
Good afternoon. I'll keep this short for everybody's benefit. But I've kept quite quiet today. Our client's position has been largely covered by others throughout the day. Excuse me. As we set out in our hearing statement, as a business operating in Halton, our client is broadly supportive of the council's aspirations for economic growth and the aspirations of a housing target to support this aspiration. Our two specific concerns have also been discussed in depth today, so I shan't rehearse them, but they're the council's assumption. The concerns are that the council's assumption that adopting a figure above the standard methodology is in itself a justification, and that the figures adopted do not appear to be supported by clear evidence or to show clear working, to borrow a phrase. And then just separately, there's been a significant number of items that are to be investigated and responded to by the council after today's session. We'd welcome the opportunity to review these and to consider whether it impacts on our client's position. Thank you.
Certainly, yes. Just as a general point, obviously, if new information or information which clarifies the council position is produced, obviously there would be the opportunity to comment on that within reason, not an opportunity to totally rehearse arguments. So I think, well, I'd like to thank you all for a very constructive discussion. It has been quite technical and dry in places, and I think everyone's done well to hang on in there and stay with us. And I just thank you for your patience today. The council wanted to clarify the action points. If Mrs. Brindley, have you been keeping a running total? I believe Mr. Troy has been keeping a total on my behalf. Who'd be distracting, chairing the discussion and taking notes at the same time. Mrs. Brindley, did you want to run through the action points that you've taken, and then we can say whether you've picked them all up?
Yes, that would be quite helpful, please. So we intend to liaise with JL Home Consultants regarding clarification on the uplift figures used in the evidence base. The local authority is to send over the uplift figures used in the council's hearing statement in relation to matter 4 of the hearing statements that were provided, and the council will provide justification for such uplift. We're going to supply the sectoral growth information and the growth value added, and we're going to try and find some information on the delay in contracts with regards to the transformational and strategic sites and the info supplied by the council's regeneration team, and try and get a bit more clarity on that issue. We're going to upload information on site-specific sectors and provide clarification and interpretation of the data supplied, showing the baseline and growth figures. And we're going to provide reassurance on sites coming forward, the projected rates put forward to inform the hearing, and in order to address issues of jobs not coming forward, as there will be an impact on the housing requirement. And finally, to add a note to the table in Appendix 1 of the Council's Matter 4A response, to explain and provide a summary of how it was produced. I think that's everything.
Yes, I think that covers sort of the points that I had listed. I'm just looking to Mr. Troy. I know he said he'd keep a list of action points as well to aid myself as I was chairing the discussion. Does that concur with your points?
Yeah, that's absolutely fine. Yeah, that covers everything. I think I've noted as well during the discussion, so thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you, Mr. Troy. Well, thank you again for all of your contributions. I shall no doubt see some of you, we'll see some of you tomorrow. And just thank you again for your time and patience. I shall adjourn the hearings until tomorrow. Thank you.